Archie Goodwin here. Welcome back to Riddle Country. I could tell you today's story starts with a man broken at the foot of a 15-foot platform found by his own crew at first light. But this one starts smaller than that and quieter. It starts with a hook and eye latch that caught clean every single time I tested it and hadn't caught at all the one night it needed to. A brownstone left standing empty of its owner for the first time in longer than I care to think about. 3 of 6 dogs loaded into a car bound for a rented farmhouse 90 miles up the Hudson, and a citrus conservatory that was about to learn exactly what Nero Wolfe thinks of inadequate heating. A pit bull who once walked 200 miles for a dead man, taking up a post on a strange porch rail like he'd guarded it his whole life. A page torn clean from a county ledger, close enough to the spine that whoever did it wanted it gone for good, and a second copy of that same page, water-stained and forgotten in a Poughkeepsie basement, that nobody thought to go looking for until it was already too late for the man who'd found it first. A car parked at a locked gate at 11 o'clock. Its lights cut the moment a farm dog barked 2 fields over. A war buddy who'd been carrying another man's secret for 15 years, waiting for somebody to finally ask him the right name. A cidery owner circling the same acreage for 2 years, and a land offer that got a great deal more generous right around the time a careful man stopped being careful. And then there's the detail nobody in that valley wanted to say out loud, that the name on the old fraud and the name on the estate's own legal letterhead had been the same man all along, and that a decade of respectability was worth exactly 1 latched rail, on exactly 1 dark night, under a moon that was supposed to be keeping watch over nothing more dangerous than the last of the apples. So get comfortable. This one's called a Nero Wolfe puzzle, the Harvest Moon Vigil. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The Orchid's Shadow. I have seen Nero Wolfe unhappy in a great many ways. I have seen him unhappy when the beer delivery came late, unhappy when a client wasted his time with a lie so thin you could read a newspaper through it, unhappy when Theodore let a phalaenopsis go 3 degrees below regulation overnight, but I had never in the 9 years I'd worked for him seen him unhappy the particular way he was unhappy sitting in a rented farmhouse 40-odd miles up the Hudson, glaring at a window as though the window had personally arranged for him to be there. "Archie," he said, "what is the hour?" "6:15, I said, though he had a perfectly good watch, and I suspected the question wasn't really about the hour at all, which means it's 20 minutes since you last asked, and you already know the conservatory here doesn't keep to your schedule anyway, so I don't see what checking accomplishes." He made a sound low in his chest, something between a sigh and a growl. The kind of sound a bear might make if you told it hibernation had been cancelled for the year. Around us, the farmhouse creaked in a way our brownstone never creaked. Old wood settling against an early autumn wind. The kind of house that talks to itself at night. Caesar lay across the threshold to the kitchen with his chin on his paws, ears swiveling at every new sound the way a man's eyes might dart at every stranger in an unfamiliar bar. Diana had claimed the window seat, nose pressed to the glass, watching the orchard rose go grey with dusk. Loyal as always was against my leg, solid and warm, the brass plate on his collar catching the last of the light. "You seat West 35th Street, a long way from here." "I did not agree to a farmhouse," Wolfe said. "I agreed, under duress and against every instinct I possess, to a temporary change of residence for the purpose of resolving a matter that could easily have been resolved by correspondence. You agreed because Mrs. Hartwell offered enough money to keep your orchid budget healthy through a bad winter, and because you were curious the second she said the word vigil. Don't pretend otherwise. I was in the room." He didn't dignify that with a response, which I took as confirmation, and a moment later the sound of tires on gravel put an end to the conversation entirely. Diana was up and at the window in one motion, a low sound in her throat that wasn't quite a bark. Caesar rose without hurry, planted himself between us and the door, and waited. The alpha's job isn't to react first, it's to decide when reacting is warranted. A car door. Footsteps on the porch, quick and light. A woman's stride, but not an easy one. I've walked behind enough nervous clients to know the rhythm. Loyal's ears came up. Then a knock, 3 raps, a pause, 1 more, like she'd started to knock properly and lost her nerve halfway through and had to force the last one out. I opened the door to a woman somewhere in her 40s, dark hair going grey at the temples in a way she hadn't bothered to hide. wearing a wool coat that had seen better winters and shoes not meant for a gravel drive. Her eyes went past me to the dogs, widened slightly, and then found Wolfe's bulk in the chair by the cold fireplace. "Mr. Wolfe, I'm Rosalind Hartwell. I telephoned yesterday." "You did," Wolfe said, without rising, which he never does for anyone. "Come in, Mrs. Hartwell. Archie, brandy, I think, given the hour and the look of our guest." She sat where I put her, in the chair angled toward Wolfe's, and Diana came and settled by her feet with the particular attentiveness she reserves for people who are frightened rather than merely troubled. Mrs. Hartwell noticed, glanced down, and some of the tension went out of her shoulders, the way it does for people who read a dog's calm as permission to feel calmer themselves. "I'll say plainly what I said on the telephone," she began, "because I don't think dressing it up will help either of us. Amos Ferris has managed this orchard for 26 years. He was more of a father to me after my own died than most fathers manage to be while they're alive. 9 days ago, during the vigil, he fell from the harvest platform in the north orchard and broke his neck. The county sheriff calls it an accident. The insurance company calls it something they won't have to pay out on unless somebody proves otherwise. And I call it neither, because Amos Ferris had climbed that platform 1,000 times in the dark and never so much as turned an ankle." "The vigil," Wolfe said. Not a question exactly, more an invitation to elaborate, the way he'll turn a phrase over to see what falls out of it. "It's tradition, older than the orchard's papers. If you believe the stories, my grandfather said his grandfather kept it. The night before the final pick, under the full harvest moon, someone stands watch over the last vulnerable trees till dawn. It started, so far as anyone can document it, as protection against frost and thieves. During the war, it took on a more practical purpose. There were things worth guarding that weren't only apples. Amos had kept the vigil himself, or overseen whoever did, every year of his tenure. This year he insisted on keeping it alone. He was found at first light, at the base of the platform, in the row nearest the creek boundary. And the insurance company's reluctance, Wolfe said, stems from what, specifically? The platform's safety rail was found unlatched. Amos latched that rail every single time he climbed, out of habit more than caution. I watched him do it 1,000 times myself. The adjuster says an unlatched rail on a dark night is exactly the kind of ordinary carelessness that produces exactly this kind of ordinary accident. I say a man doesn't break a 26-year habit on the one night a year he was keeping a promise older than his own life. Wolfe's eyes had gone to half-mast, which meant he was listening harder, not less. "You employ a lawyer, Mrs. Hartwell?" "Walter Combs. He's handled the estate's affairs since before I was born, more or less. He tells me I'm distressing myself over nothing that can be proven." "And do you believe him?" She was quiet a moment. Diana shifted, resting her chin against the woman's shoe, and Mrs. Hartwell's hand found the dog's head without seeming to notice she'd done it. "I believe," she said carefully, "that Walter has been very insistent I let this go. And I believe that in the 3 weeks before he died, Amos was asking the county clerk's office about shipping manifests from during the war. I don't know why. He never told me. And now a man wants to buy land bordering my creek that he's wanted for 2 years and never offered a fair price for. And suddenly the offer's gone very generous, and I don't understand any of it. And I would like someone whose judgment I trust to tell me whether I'm imagining a conspiracy or standing in the middle of one." Wolfe was silent long enough that I thought he might actually turn her down. The fee hadn't been mentioned yet, and he does enjoy making people work for his attention. But I caught the flicker of interest he gets when a case has more architecture to it than the client herself understands, and I knew which way this was going before he opened his mouth. "I make no promises about what I will find, Mrs. Hartwell, only that I will look honestly. That is frequently more uncomfortable for a client than a comfortable lie would be." He glanced toward the cold hearth of the little glass conservatory, visible through the side door. The farmhouse's previous owner had used it for citrus, and Wolfe had spent that morning in a towering sulk over its inadequate heating apparatus. "I will require a retainer commensurate with the inconvenience of this residence, and I will require that no one interfere with my schedule beyond what the investigation itself demands." "Of course," she said, and named a figure that made Wolfe's shoulders settle by a visible half-inch. Tied, she explained, to a share of the orchard's harvest value, which appealed to something in him I suspect was more aesthetic than mercenary. though with Wolfe you can never entirely separate the two. Then we have an arrangement, Wolfe said. Archie will begin tomorrow. Go home, Mrs. Hartwell, and sleep if you can manage it. She rose, and at the door she paused, looking back at the 3 dogs arranged around the room like sentries who'd already decided she was worth guarding. They're remarkable animals. They are family, Wolfe said, in the particular tone that closed the subject. And Fritz. No, not Fritz. I caught myself. Fritz was 40 miles south with Mars and Apollo and Minerva holding the brownstone, and it was old Mrs. Kessler, the farmhouse's cook for hire, banging a pot in the kitchen, showed Mrs. Hartwell to her car. When the gravel had gone quiet again, Wolfe sat looking at the dead fireplace for a long moment. Archie. Yes. Tomorrow you will go to the orchard, and you will look at everything, and you will ask about shipping manifests, and you will not, under any circumstances, let anyone convince you that a 26-year habit breaks itself for no reason at all. Wasn't planning to, I said, and Loyal, sensing the conversation had reached its natural end, gave a small sigh and settled deeper against my leg, the brass plate on his collar catching one last gleam of firelight before the room went properly dark. Chapter 2. The Weight of Windfall. I woke the next morning to the sound of Wolfe arguing with a citrus conservatory, which is not a sentence I ever expected to write, but there it is. Through the side door I could see him standing over a cast-iron stove some previous tenant had rigged to keep frost off the glass in winter, jabbing a finger at it, as though it had personally insulted his orchids. The 7 pots he'd insisted on bringing along, wrapped in burlap for the drive up, currently arranged on a shelf that got exactly 4 hours of morning sun, and none of the afternoon variety he considered essential. This apparatus is an insult to horticulture, he informed me, when I came in for coffee. It's an insult to your schedule, which isn't the same thing, and the orchids look fine to me. They look adequate, which for a Miltania is a form of suffering. He turned from the stove with the particular dignity of a man conceding a point without admitting he was conceding it. Sit. Before you drive to that orchard, I want your judgment on something. I sat, because when Wolfe wants your judgment before sending you into the field, it usually means he's already decided something and wants to see if you'll arrive at it independently, which is a game I've played long enough to be good at. Mrs. Hartwell offers a fee tied to harvest value. He said, a woman who believes her orchard's fortunes are precarious does not offer that kind of arrangement lightly, and a woman frightened enough to visit 2 detectives in 1 week, for she told me, as you were fetching the brandy, that she'd also spoken with a private investigator out of Poughkeepsie who declined the case, is a woman who has already priced her own fear at more than she's willing to say aloud. So the money's not about the orchard's value, it's about how much she's willing to spend to be told she isn't crazy. Refine that. She does not want to be told she isn't crazy. She wants to be told the truth, and she has already priced the possibility that the truth will cost her the land itself. He picked up his coffee, drank half of it in the manner of a man performing a chore. Go. Look at the platform. Look at the ladder. Look, particularly, at anyone who tells you with too much confidence exactly what happened that night, because confidence of that kind is either honesty or its most convincing impersonation, and at this stage I have no way to tell you which. Anything else? Yes. Ask about the shipping manifests. Ask specifically, and ask as though you already half know the answer, because people confirm suspicions far more readily than they volunteer facts. I took the car, a borrowed Ford that handled like a wheelbarrow full of gravel compared to my own, but it got me up the county road and through the Hartwell gate by 9:30, past a hand-painted sign reading Hartwell Orchards Est, 1881, that had clearly been repainted more than once in 80 years without anyone bothering to update the date. The orchard itself was something to see. Rows of trees heavy with fruit stretching toward a tree line that marked the creek boundary. Mrs. Hartwell had mentioned pickers moving through the rows with canvas bags slung over their shoulders, the whole operation smelling of cider apples going soft in the morning sun. I found the harvest platform easily enough. A wooden tower maybe 15 feet high, built to give a watchman sight lines over the whole north section, with a ladder up one side and a rail around a small platform at the top. The rail's latch was a simple hook and eye arrangement, rusted just enough to suggest age rather than neglect. I climbed up and worked it myself a dozen times. It caught clean every time, snug enough that you'd feel its seat, loose enough that a careless hand might miss the click. Ordinary carelessness, the adjuster had said. Maybe, or maybe a man who'd latched that hook 1,000 times in the dark by feel alone hadn't been the one who unlatched it the 1,001st time. "You'll be the detective." The voice came from below, a woman about my age, weathered by outdoor work, wiping her hands on a canvas apron. "Mrs. Hartwell said you'd come around." "Archie Goodwin." "And you are?" "Nell Buckley. I run the packing shed, mostly, but I've picked this orchard 11 years, same as everyone here worth talking to." She looked up at me on the platform with something between curiosity and suspicion. "You're wondering about the latch?" "I'm wondering about a lot of things. Start with Amos Ferris. What kind of man was he?" "Careful, stubborn, the kind who'd fix a fence himself sooner than pay someone to do it wrong." She hesitated. "And worried, this last month or so. Not the kind of worried he'd talk about. The kind where you catch him standing still in the middle of a row, looking at nothing, and when you ask he says he's fine and goes back to work twice as hard as before." "Worried about what?" "I don't know. But he went into town 3-4 times, asking after old records at the county clerk's, shipping manifests, someone said. Though I couldn't tell you why an orchard foreman needs shipping manifests from 20 years back." She shrugged, but it wasn't a careless shrug. It was the shrug of someone who'd wondered about it plenty and gotten nowhere. "You should talk to Thomas Reyes. He was out that night, past when he should have been, and he hasn't said 2 words about it since, which isn't like him." "Where do I find him?" "Bunkhouse, 2nd row. But he won't want to talk to you. He didn't want to talk to the sheriff either, and the sheriff didn't push because the sheriff's already decided what happened and doesn't much care for complications." I climbed down and thanked her, and as I walked toward the bunkhouses, I passed a man in a good coat standing at the edge of the orchard, near the creek, looking at the tree line the way a man looks at something he's already decided he owns. He caught me looking and came over, hand extended before I'd even said hello. "Desmond Price. I own the cidery 2 miles down the county road." He had the handshake of a man who'd practiced it. "You'll be working for Rosalind." "Terrible business, Ferris. Terrible." "You knew him?" 20 years. Near enough. Everyone up this valley knew Amos." A pause, calibrated to seem casual. "I imagine this puts Rosalind in a difficult spot. The insurance trouble and all the rest of it. I've made her a fair offer on the Creekbank acreage more than once. Might be the timing works out better for her now than it did before." "Might?" I said, non-committal, filing away that a man doesn't mention the convenient timing of another man's death unless the convenience has occurred to him more than once. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about wartime shipping manifests, would you, Mr. Price?" Something crossed his face, quick, controlled, gone before I could properly name it. "Can't say I would. Why do you ask?" "No reason," I said, "the way you say it when you very much mean the opposite," and left him standing at the tree line with his good coat and his patient offer, looking, I thought, considerably less at ease than he had a minute before. Chapter 3. Under the Waning Light. Thomas Reyes was maybe 25, built like a man who'd done hard outdoor work his whole life, and about as eager to talk to me as a cat is to take a bath. I found him mending a picking ladder outside the bunkhouse, and he kept his eyes on the rungs the whole time I talked, answering in single words until I sat down on an overturned crate across from him and made it clear I wasn't leaving. "Nell says you were out past when you should have been, the night Amos died." "Nell talks too much." "Maybe. Doesn't make her wrong." I let that sit a moment. "I'm not the sheriff, Thomas. I don't have a badge, and I can't make you say anything. But a man's dead, who by every account was careful his whole life, and if you saw something that might tell us why he wasn't careful that one night, keeping quiet doesn't protect him anymore. It just protects whoever's glad you're keeping quiet." He set the ladder down. For a long moment, he looked like he might get up and walk away, and then instead, something in his shoulders gave. "I saw a car," he said, "parked on the county road past the north gate, maybe 11 o'clock, not one I knew. I didn't think much of it. Folks park along there for the view sometimes, even at night, kids mostly. But I saw it again around 1, still there, and that's when I started paying attention, because nobody sits in a parked car for 2 hours in October for the scenery. Did you see who was in it? Too dark. I got maybe 30 feet closer, trying to see, and a dog started up, not one of yours, some farm dog down the road. And whoever it was, they must have heard it too, because the car pulled off quiet, lights off till it hit the bend. I went back to my own business, didn't think about it again till morning, when they found Amos. You told the sheriff this? Sheriff Dell asked me if I'd seen anything unusual, and I said no. He looked at me then, finally, and there was something like shame in it. Amos got me this job when nobody else would take a chance on me. I owe him better than what I gave the sheriff, but I've got a sister in this county too, and Sheriff Dell's cousin owns the feed store that's the only one that'll extend her credit, and I didn't want trouble I couldn't afford. What made you tell me then? That you asked like you already believed something was wrong. Sheriff asked like he wanted permission to believe nothing was. That was a distinction worth carrying back to Wolfe, and I told him so when I got back to the farmhouse that evening, laying it all out, the latch, Nell Buckley, Price's offer, and his flinch at the mention of manifests, Reyes's car on the county road. Wolfe listened with his eyes closed, which with him means total attention, rather than sleep, and when I finished, he sat with it a while before speaking. A parked car with its lights extinguished on approach is not the behavior of an innocent visitor enjoying a rural view, he said. It is the behavior of someone who did not wish to be identified, and who had reason to believe identification was a genuine risk, meaning someone who expected to be recognized if seen clearly. That narrows your suspects to people locally known, which in a county this size is nearly everyone, but it excludes strangers entirely. Price is local, known to everyone, by his own account. Indeed. But a man circling for 2 years around a piece of land does not typically resort to murder over a bad deal. Land negotiations, however protracted, rarely escalate to that. There is a second motive beneath the first, and I suspect the shipping manifests are its spine. He opened his eyes. Tomorrow you will go to the county clerk's office and request precisely the records Ferris requested. If they will not tell you what he asked for, ask what he was shown, and if that fails, ask what was missing when he looked. A document conspicuously absent from an otherwise complete file tells you as much as one present. And if the clerk won't cooperate at all, then you will discover who instructed the clerk not to, which will itself be informative. He reached for his beer, which meant the working portion of the evening had concluded as far as he was concerned. Also, you will telephone Saul. I want the wartime record of anyone locally prominent enough to have handled rationing enforcement or supply contracts in this county between 1942 and 9. I made the call before dinner, and Saul, never one to waste words on the phone, took the assignment the way he took every assignment. With a flat, I'll have something by Thursday, and I believed him, because Saul Panzer has never once told me a day he'd have something and then not had it. Dinner that night was passable. Mrs. Kessler was a decent enough cook, though nothing that would have satisfied Fritz's standards, and Wolfe ate with the resigned dignity of a man doing his duty rather than enjoying his life. Afterward, on the porch, Caesar took up his usual post at the top of the steps. Diana ranged the tree line at the orchard's edge with her nose working the wind, and Loyal lay across the threshold like he'd been carved there. Around 10, Diana's low growl brought me out of my chair. Headlights, far off on the county road, slowing near the gate before speeding up again and passing on. Probably nothing. Probably a farmer heading home late, or kids parking for a view, same as Thomas Reyes had described. But Diana held her position at the tree line another 20 minutes before she'd settle, and I found myself standing at the porch rail a good while longer than the night warranted, watching a road that had already gone dark and quiet, thinking about a man who'd latched a rail 1,000 times and hadn't latched it the one night that mattered. Chapter Foo, the Cider Press Confessions. The Hartwell Cider House sat at the orchard's western edge, a long low building smelling permanently of fermenting apples, and it was there, at Wolfe's instruction, that I arranged to meet the principal players, one by one, ostensibly to discuss estate matters relating to the investigation, which was vague enough to get everyone in the door without tipping my hand about what I actually wanted from each of them. Walter Combs came first, precisely on time, which told me something all by itself. A lawyer who bills by the hour doesn't dawdle, but a lawyer with nothing to hide doesn't usually arrive early to a conversation he'd rather not have either. He was a tall man, gone soft in the middle, with the particular smoothness of someone who'd spent 30 years being the most reasonable voice in every room he entered. "Mr. Goodwin, Rosalind mentioned she'd engaged your Mr. Wolfe. I confess I advised against it." "She mentioned that too. Why?" "Because grief looks for shapes to blame, and a distinguished detective is an expensive way to discover that sometimes an accident is simply an accident." He said it smoothly, the way a man says a thing he's said before to an audience that believed it. Amos was not a young man. The platform is not a modern structure. These things happen on farms. "You handle the estate's finances, Mr. Combs?" "I have for 11 years. Ever come across shipping manifests in that time? Old ones from the war years?" The pause was small, smaller than prices had been, but I've made a living noticing small things, and I noticed it. "The estate's records go back generations, Mr. Goodwin. I couldn't tell you what's in every box in every cellar." Amos could have, apparently. He was asking after them the month before he died. "Was he?" Combs folded his hands on the table between us, a gesture I'd bet money he used in negotiations to buy himself a second's thought. "I wasn't aware. Amos and I were not close confidants." He answered to Rosalind, not to me. "But you'd know if the estate had something worth hiding in those old records." "I would know if the estate had a liability, Mr. Goodwin, which is my job to know. Whether that constitutes something worth hiding rather depends on one's perspective, doesn't it?" He rose before I could press further, smooth as ever. "I hope your Mr. Wolfe finds Amos died the way the sheriff believes he did. It would spare a grieving woman a great deal of unnecessary pain, or spare somebody else a great deal of unnecessary exposure," I thought. But I let him go without saying it. Gideon Marsh came next, and he was a different animal entirely. A big man, weathered, with the look of someone who'd spent the war somewhere unpleasant and never fully come home from it. He sat heavily and didn't wait for me to start. "You want to know about Amos and me? Fine. We served together. Quartermaster Corps, both of us, out of the same depot near here before we shipped out. He was the better man of the two of us, and I mean that plain, not as some grief talk. What did a Quartermaster Corps do exactly that would matter 20 years later?" Marsh's jaw worked a moment. "We moved supplies, rationed goods. There's a version of that job where you do it straight, and there's a version where you don't. And I'll tell you honestly, Mr. Goodwin, not every man in that depot did it straight. Amos found out things toward the end that some folks would rather stayed found out by nobody." "Did he tell you what he found?" "No, but he asked me, a month back, whether I remembered the name of the supply officer who ran our sector. Fella named Holleran, if my memory serves, though I haven't heard that name in 15 years and couldn't tell you if he's even still breathing." Marsh looked at his hands. "I owe Amos my life twice over from those years, Mr. Goodwin. If somebody put him in the ground over something from back then, I'd want to know it, and I'd want to know it bad enough that maybe you shouldn't tell your Mr. Wolfe everything I just told you until you're sure who you're telling it in front of." That was a warning worth taking seriously, and I filed it accordingly. Agnes Doyle, the estate housekeeper, was the last of the day, and she was frightened in a way that had nothing to do with Amos Ferris at all. I could see it the moment she sat down, hands twisting in her lap, eyes going to the door twice before she'd said a word. "Mrs. Doyle, I only want to ask about the night Amos died. Nothing else." "I don't know anything about that night. I was asleep in my own quarters." "All right, then let me ask you something different. Are you skimming from the household accounts?" Her face went the color of old paper. That's not. Mr. Combs handles the accounts. I'm not the sheriff. And unless it connects to Amos Ferris's death, it's none of my business what you've taken or why. But I need to know if it does connect. And the only way I can know that is if you tell me the truth instead of making me guess." She was quiet, a long moment, and when she spoke her voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. "There's money missing. That isn't mine. Small amounts, here and there, going back years, long before I ever touched $1 of it myself, which I only started doing because I saw it happening already and thought, why shouldn't I, if no one's watching close enough to notice either way?" Amos found the discrepancy. He didn't accuse me. He asked me, very gentle, whether I knew where old money went in an estate this size, going back a long way. I told him I didn't. I lied to him, Mr. Goodwin, because I was afraid, and 2 weeks later he was dead, and I have not slept a full night since, wondering if my lie is why. It was the most honest thing anyone had told me all day, and it didn't answer the question so much as widen it, because now there were two threads running under the Hartwell orchard soil, an old wartime fraud and a smaller, sadder theft riding along beside it. And I couldn't yet tell whether they were tangled together or simply two separate rot spots in the same old tree. Chapter 5. A Second Vigil. I got back to the farmhouse to find Wolfe in a mood I can only describe as satisfied annoyed, which is his particular flavor of pleasure at a puzzle deepening exactly as he'd suspected it would. "Hulleran," he said, before I'd even sat down, "is a name Saul telephoned an hour ago. A supply officer, Quartermaster Corps, stationed near this county during the war, subject of an informal inquiry in 1944 regarding discrepancies in rationed goods that was quietly closed without charges when the officer in question was reassigned. Saul is tracing what became of him afterward. Marsh gave me the same name. Said Amos asked him about it a month back. Then we have convergence, which is always encouraging." He was about to say more when Diana's bark from the porch cut him off, sharp, urgent, entirely unlike her usual measured warnings. Caesar was already at the door, and Loyal came up off the threshold like he'd been launched. I got there in time to see headlights swing wide on the county road and vanish, too far to chase on foot, but close enough that whoever it was had clearly been sitting near the gate again, and this time, when I checked the farmhouse, the kitchen window on the side facing the orchard had been forced, just slightly, a thin pry mark at the latch that hadn't been there that morning. "Nothing's missing," I told Wolfe, having gone through the downstairs twice, but somebody wanted in badly enough to try before Diana ran them off. Wolfe's expression didn't change, but I've learned to read the stillness under it. Whoever attempted that entry believed there was something here worth the risk of 3 dogs in an occupied house. That is either recklessness or desperation, and desperation is the more instructive of the two. Before I could answer, tires crunched on the drive. Proper tires, this time, not fleeing ones, and a man climbed out who I recognized from Mrs. Hartwell's description as Sheriff Dell, middle-aged, sun-weathered, wearing the expression of a man who considered his job mostly finished and resented anyone suggesting otherwise. "Got a call from your Mrs. Kessler about a prowler," he said, not bothering with introductions. "You'd be the New York detective. Archie Goodwin. Mr. Wolfe's inside." Dell's eyes went to Caesar, planted solid in the doorway, and something in his face suggested he wasn't fond of large dogs, or perhaps just this particular arrangement of large dog blocking his path. "I'll want to look at that window." He looked, made a note, and made it clear throughout that he considered the whole business, the prowler, our presence, the entire notion that Amos Ferris's death merited a second look, an inconvenience visited on him by outsiders who didn't understand how things worked up here. "Ferris fell," he said, when Wolfe finally came to the door. Man was 61 years old, out alone at night on a 15-foot platform. On ground he'd have known blind, except it wasn't blind, was it? It was dark, and dark does things to a man's footing that familiarity doesn't fix. "You examined the latch yourself?" Wolfe asked. I examined the man's neck, which was broken, and the ground he landed on, which was hard, and I didn't need a latch to tell me gravity works the same up here as it does in the city. Dell's patience, thin to begin with, had about run out. "I've got a county to run, Mr. Wolfe, and Amos Ferris's death isn't the only thing on my desk. If you find something that isn't a rich woman's grief talking, you bring it to me and I'll act on it same as I would anything else. Until then, I'd take it as a courtesy if your dogs didn't treat my visits like an invasion." He left without much more ceremony than he'd arrived with, and Caesar watched the car all the way down the drive before finally relaxing his stance, which I took as the dog's professional opinion of the sheriff's investigation, and one I largely shared. "He is not stupid," Wolfe said once the taillights had gone, "merely incurious, which in a position of authority amounts to the same practical result. He has decided the shape of this matter, and will not trouble himself to notice a shape doesn't fit. So we keep going without him. We keep going regardless of him. Wolfe settled back into his chair with the air of a man returning to more important business, namely, whether the conservatory stove could be coaxed to hold heat through the night without scorching the Miltania. Tomorrow, find Thomas Reyes again. I want a description of that car down to the make if he can manage it, and I want you at the county clerk's office the moment it opens, asking after Amos Ferris's requests with considerably more specificity than a stranger's curiosity would warrant. Chapter 6. The Quartermaster's Ledger. Elijah. The county clerk was a bird-like woman named Miss Farrow, who'd clearly been told by someone to be unhelpful, though she wasn't practiced enough at it to hide the fact. She stonewalled me for a good 10 minutes on the general principle that old shipping records were not for public browsing, until I mentioned carefully the way Wolfe had suggested that I already knew Amos Ferris had requested a specific manifest series and that I only needed to know which one, since a man had died and the county's own sheriff might take an interest in why his records office was suddenly so protective of paperwork nobody usually cared about. That got her moving, if reluctantly. He asked for the 43 and 44 depot manifests, rationed goods shipped through the county depot near the Orchard Road. Did he see them? He saw what was there, which wasn't complete. Page 11 of the 44 ledgers missing has been since before I started this job, and I told him so, same as I'm telling you. Missing how? Torn out. Misfiled. What? Torn. Along the binding, close enough to the spine that whoever did it wanted it gone clean, not just misplaced. She lowered her voice, glancing toward the door the way people do when they're about to say something they've decided is safe, only because they've decided you already half know it. Mr. Ferris asked me the same thing you're asking. And a week after he asked, Mr. Combs came in himself, first time I've seen him in this office in 3 years, and asked whether anyone else had requested those manifests recently. I told him about Mr. Ferris. I didn't think anything of it till now. That was the thread pulling tight. I thanked her and drove straight for the bunkhouse, where Thomas Reyes, true to his word once given, gave me what he could. A dark sedan, older model, one headlight slightly dimmer than the other, like it needed a new bulb. Not much, but enough that Saul, when I telephoned it through, said he could work with it. Saul called back that evening with what he'd found, and it filled in the shape Wolfe had been sketching since Chapter 2. Halloran, the supply officer, had never faced charges in 1944. The inquiry closed quietly, the man reassigned, and by 1946 he'd resurfaced under a name close enough to his own that Saul had needed only a day to connect them. Walter Combs had served as W. Halloran Combs before the war, going by his middle name in service records for reasons nobody Saul spoke to could explain, and dropping it entirely upon return to civilian life. The estate lawyer who'd advised Rosalind Hartwell to drop the investigation, who'd flinched at the mention of manifests, who'd shown up at the clerk's office, asking pointed questions the week after Amos Ferris had Walter Combs and the wartime quartermaster under informal investigation for rationing fraud, were the same man. Wolfe received this news the way he receives most confirmations of his own suspicions, with a small, satisfied exhalation through the nose, nothing more dramatic than that. He has spent a decade becoming a respectable pillar of this county's legal establishment, Wolfe said. Amos Ferris, stumbling onto an old fraud through nothing more than an orchard's own shipping records, threatened to unmake that decade in a single conversation. That is motive of the plainest kind. What we lack is the mechanism, proof that Combs was the man in that car, and proof, more importantly, that he was the one who unlatched a rail he had no legitimate reason to have touched. Price is still in the picture too, I reminded him. The land offer, the flinch at manifests. Price may simply have his own reasons to want that boundary settled quickly, unconnected to murder. A man circling a purchase for 2 years develops nerves about any complication, guilty or not. But test it. Tomorrow, arrange for Price and Combs to be in the same room, ostensibly discussing the land sale on the estate's behalf, and observe which of the two is more disturbed by the other's presence. He reached for his beer. Guilt recognizes guilt more readily than innocence recognizes anything at all. Chapter 7. Voices in the Barn. I set the meeting for the following afternoon in the old grain barn at the Orchard Center. Neutral ground, I told both men. Better suited to a frank discussion about the boundary sale than Combs's office or Price's cidery. Neither seemed to love the location, which suited me fine. Wolfe, characteristically, had refused to make the drive twice in 1 week, and instead had me carry a series of questions to put to each man, phrased precisely enough that I could report their answers back nearly word for word. Price arrived first, in his good coat, considerably less at ease than our first meeting at the tree line. "This is an odd place for a land discussion, Mr. Goodwin. Mr. Wolfe likes odd arrangements. Humor him. I let a beat pass. Tell me about your offer on the Creekbank acreage. Specifically, why it got so much more generous right around the time Amos Ferris died." His jaw tightened. "I don't like the implication." "I haven't made one yet. I'm asking a question." "The offer improved," he said, choosing words with visible care, "because my accountant found room in this year's figures that wasn't there last year. That's the whole of it. I had nothing to do with what happened to that man, and I'll tell you plainly, Mr. Goodwin, I've had more sleepless nights over the suspicion of it than most men have over actual guilt, because I know exactly how it looks and I can't prove a negative." "You flinched when I mentioned shipping manifests. Twice now." He was quiet a moment, and when he spoke again, something in his posture had eased, like a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying too long alone. "My father ran freight through that depot during the war. I don't know everything he did, and I've spent 20 years not wanting to know, because I built this business clean and I didn't want an old man's mistakes attached to my name. When you said manifests, I thought you'd come to dig up my father's ledger, not Amos Ferris's death. That's the truth, and it's an uglier truth than murder, in its way, but it isn't murder." That rang true enough that I believed him, provisionally, and I said as much when comms arrived 10 minutes later, finding Price already seated and clearly displeased about it. "I wasn't told Mr. Price would be present," comms said, smooth as ever, though the smoothness had a strain in it now that hadn't been there in our first conversation. "Land matters concern both parties," I said. "Sit down, Mr. Comms. I want to ask you about page 11. The smoothness cracked, not much, a hairline fracture, but I'd been watching for it, and I caught it clean. "I don't know what you mean." Page 11 of the 1944 Depot Manifest. Torn out clean along the spine. Amos Ferris asked after it 3 weeks before he died. You asked the clerk who else had requested it, a week after he did. I let that sit. I also know that Walter Combs served during the war as W. Holleran Combs, Quartermaster Corps, subject of an inquiry into rationing fraud that closed quietly when the officer in question got reassigned. That's an interesting name to have quietly retired, Mr. Combs. The color went out of his face by degrees, like watching a photograph fade in sunlight. Price, beside him, had gone very still, watching the same collapse I was, and I saw the exact moment Price understood he'd spent weeks suspected of a crime that belonged, root and branch, to the man who'd been advising Rosalind Hartwell to abandon her own investigation. "You have no proof of anything," Combs said. But the words came out thin, a man reciting a line he no longer believed. "I have a torn page, a changed name, a widow's insurance company that won't pay, and a man Ferris asked about a supply officer named Hollerar a month before he died." I stood. "Mr. Wolfe will want to see you both at the farmhouse tomorrow evening. I'd suggest you come, Mr. Combs, because the alternative is Mr. Wolfe drawing his own conclusions in front of Sheriff Dell without the benefit of your side of it." I left them there in the barn, Price looking at Combs with the dawning furious relief of an innocent man, realizing exactly who'd let him twist in suspicion's wind, and Combs looking at nothing at all, the way a man looks when he's just watched a decade's careful reconstruction come apart along a seam. He thought he'd sewn shut for good. Chapter 8. The Trap in the Orchard Rose. Wolfe, upon hearing my report, did not immediately move to a confrontation, which surprised me, until he explained himself over dinner that evening, Caesar stationed at the door, Diana pacing the porch rail with the restlessness of a dog who sensed the case tightening toward its close. A torn page and a changed name establish motive and opportunity for concealment, Wolfe said. They do not establish that Walter Combs climbed that platform and unlatched that rail. A confession obtained through confrontation alone, without a lever, is a confession a competent lawyer, and Combs is nothing if not competent, can retract by morning, citing the pressure of the moment. I require something he cannot retract. Such as a document he believes destroyed, produced in front of him without warning. Wolfe set down his fork with the deliberateness of a man arriving at a plan. Page 11 was torn from the county's ledger. But a depot of that size moving goods under wartime rationing would have kept duplicate records, a shipping company's own copy, distinct from the government's, precisely because wartime bureaucracies distrusted single points of failure. Saul will know where such duplicates might have survived, if they survived at all. Telephone him tonight. Saul, called at an hour most men would resent, spent 2 days running down old freight company records before he found what Wolfe was gambling existed. A duplicate ledger, water-damaged but legible, mouldering in the basement of a defunct shipping concern's successor firm in Poughkeepsie. It's page 11, the company's page 11, never torn, never touched by anyone with reason to fear it, intact and damning. It showed, in a clerk's careful period hand, a pattern of rationed goods diverted from official channels under authorization signed W. Huller & Combs, routed through connections that, cross-referenced against Price's own father's freight logs, showed the elder Price had indeed moved the goods. Unknowingly it appeared, believing them legitimate government contracts, exactly as his son had feared, and exactly as innocent of intent as his son had claimed for himself. Then we have it, Wolfe said, when Saul's findings reached the farmhouse. Combs diverted rationed goods for profit under a name he later shed like a snake's old skin. Ferris found the trail through nothing more than an orchard foreman's ordinary curiosity about old paperwork. And when Ferris asked Gideon Marsh whether he remembered the name Halloran, word reached Combs, perhaps through Marsh himself, unknowing, perhaps through some other channel we need not trace precisely, that his old identity was no longer as buried as he believed. So he killed Amos to keep it buried. He killed Amos, Wolfe said, to keep it buried, and unlatched a rail he had watched Ferris latch 1,000 times on the one night a year that placed Ferris alone, in the dark at a height, with no witness but the moon he was there to watch under. Wolfe's expression, for just a moment, carried something closer to genuine anger than his usual detached distaste for murder. It is an ugly, small thing to do to a man who spent 26 years keeping faith with a tradition older than his own employment. Archie, arrange the barn again tomorrow evening. Everyone, and telephone Sheriff Dell. Tell him if his pride requires the phrasing, that I have found something that isn't a rich woman's grief talking after all. Chapter 9. Beneath the Harvest Moon. Wolfe insisted, against every practical objection I raised, that the confrontation take place not in the farmhouse but in the barn itself, at dusk, with the harvest moon near enough to full again, a month's cycle having turned since Ferris died, rising over the orchard rows outside. I suspect it was theatre as much as strategy, though with Wolfe the two rarely separate cleanly, and I'll admit the effect when it came was considerable. They assembled as instructed: Rosalind Hartwell, pale and steady; Walter Combs, composed again on the surface though I could see the strain underneath; Desmond Price, arms crossed, watching Combs with an expression that had curdled from suspicion into something closer to contempt; Gideon Marsh, solid and grim; Agnes Doyle, wringing her hands near the door; Thomas Reyes standing apart, watchful, and Sheriff Dell arrived reluctantly, arms crossed in a posture of a man reserving judgment until forced otherwise. Wolfe sat in the one chair someone had thought to bring for him. Bulk settled, hands folded over his stomach, and beside the barn's open door, Caesar and Diana took up positions like a pair of sentries flanking a throne, while Loyal came to sit, unbidden, at my side. Amos Ferris, Wolfe began, without preamble, was not a careless man, and did not become one in the space of a single night, whatever the county's insurance adjuster prefers to believe. He died because he was diligent, because a man who had managed this orchard for 26 years noticed, in the ordinary course of his duties, a discrepancy in old records that led him, with nothing more sinister than curiosity, toward a name: Halloran. Combs's face had gone rigid, but he said nothing, and Wolfe continued without hurry. During the war, a supply officer serving under the name W. Halloran Combs diverted rationed goods for personal profit through the county depot serving this valley. An inquiry into the matter closed quietly in 1944, and the officer reassigned, resurfacing after the war as a respectable estate lawyer who had quietly dropped the name that connected him to that fraud. For a decade, that connection remained buried, until Amos Ferris, tracing a shipping irregularity that had nothing originally to do with fraud at all, began asking after the name Halloran, and asking, more specifically, after manifests from 1943 and 90. This is conjecture, Combed said, but his voice had lost its courtroom polish. It was conjecture, Wolfe agreed, until 3 days ago. He nodded to me, and I produced the photostat Saul had made of the Poughkeepsie Ledger's page 11, laying it on the barrel that served as a table between us. This is a shipping company's duplicate record, never torn, never touched by the hand that destroyed the county's own copy, showing authorization for diverted rationed goods signed W. Haller and Combs. The county's page 11 was torn from its binding cleanly, close to the spine, by someone who believed no other copy existed. Someone was mistaken. The barn had gone very quiet. Price's arms had uncrossed. He was staring at Combs now, with an expression I can only call vindicated fury. "You let me sit under suspicion for weeks," Price said, low. "You encouraged it, Walter. Every conversation, every careful little comment about my offer's timing." "That proves nothing about Ferris's death," Combs said, but he was talking faster now, the smoothness fraying at the edges. "A fraud 20 years old is not a murder." "No," Wolfe said, "but a car parked at the north gate the night Ferris died, its lights extinguished on approach, witnessed, Mr. Combs, by a man you did not know was watching, narrows considerably. Sheriff Dell, I understand your department retains vehicle registrations for the county's legal professionals as a matter of routine, given how often lawyers' cars are seen at the courthouse. I would ask you to compare that registration against the description Mr. Rees provided my associate, an older sedan, one headlamp notably dimmer than its pair. Dell, to his credit, didn't need telling twice. He looked at Combs with the expression of a man recalculating a great deal very quickly. Walter drives a 48 Hudson. Left headlamps needed replacing for months. I've mentioned it to him myself at the courthouse, more than once. Combs's composure, held together by decade-old habit and considerable will, finally gave way all at once, not into confession, not quite, but into something worse for him, a silence that no lawyer's instinct could talk his way back out of, because everyone in that barn, watching his face in the lamplight, with the harvest moon rising white and full through the open door behind him, understood exactly what that silence meant. "Amos was going to talk to Rosalind," he said finally, very quietly, to no one in particular. "He came to my office. He didn't accuse me. He wasn't that kind of man. He just asked, plain as asking about the weather, whether I remembered a Lieutenant Halloran from the old depot days, because he'd found some old paperwork that troubled him, and thought I might know, given my years handling the estate's affairs, whether it was worth mentioning to Rosalind or best left buried with the rest of the war. I told him to leave it. He said he'd think on it. His hands, folded in his lap, had begun to shake. I couldn't think of anything else for a week. Everything I'd built, everyone in this county who trusts my name, one old page in one old ledger, and a decent man's ordinary curiosity, and it would all have come apart." "So you went to the orchard the night of the vigil," Wolfe said, not unkindly, which was somehow worse than if he had been, knowing Ferris would be alone at height, in the dark, keeping a tradition he'd have died before abandoning, even had he suspected the danger in it. Combs didn't answer. He didn't need to. Sheriff Dell was already moving, and Rosalind Hartwell had turned away toward the barn door, one hand pressed briefly to her mouth, looking out at the orchard rows silvered under the rising moon, the same moon Amos Ferris had died watching over, the same vigil he'd have kept faithfully till dawn, if a man he'd trusted for 11 years hadn't climbed that ladder ahead of him in the dark. Chapter 10. The Frost Settles. Sheriff Dell, to his considerable and grudging credit, moved fast once he'd finally moved at all. Combs was in county custody by midnight, and within the week a search of his office turned up correspondence with a Poughkeepsie buyer, eager to purchase the Creek Bank acreage, the moment the Hartwell estate's legal troubles made a quiet sale attractive, connections that suggested the land pressure and the murder had, after all, been two currents feeding the same river, exactly the tangle Wolfe had suspected before he'd had the shape of it clean. Price's offer, once the dust settled, turned out to have been entirely his own, guilty of nothing but bad timing and an old fear of his father's wartime freight records, both of which Rosalind Hartwell seemed inclined to forgive once the real culprit stood exposed. Agnes Doyle's smaller theft came out too, in the wash of it all, and Rosalind, in a decision Wolfe called more generous than the law would require and considerably wiser than the law would produce, chose to let the woman repay what she'd taken over time rather than press charges, on the theory that one tragedy in an orchard was enough for any autumn. We left the following morning, Wolfe supervising the packing of his 7 orchid pots with the anxious precision of a man handling munitions. Caesar and Diana loaded into the car with the settled satisfaction of dogs who'd done their job. Loyal pressed against my leg for the drive, same as he'd pressed against it every night in the farmhouse. "You'll find your real conservatory in some state of disaster," I told Wolfe as we pulled onto the county road. "Theodore's competent, but he's not you, and 3 weeks is a long time for orchids that fussy." "Do not remind me," Wolfe said, with feeling, and settled back against the seat as though bracing for the confirmation of his own worst fears. We passed the orchard gate on our way out, Hartwell Orchards St. 1881 catching the morning light, and I thought about Amos Ferris, 26 years of careful, quiet stewardship, undone in the space of one autumn night by a man who'd spent a decade convincing an entire county he was somebody he wasn't. There's a particular kind of sad in a case like that, one that doesn't resolve clean even once the guilty man's behind bars, because nothing brings back a foreman who latched a rail 1,000 times faithfully and only failed to latch it once, through no fault of his own. He kept faith with something older than himself, Wolfe said, unprompted, staring out the window at the orchard rows falling away behind us, and I understood he'd been turning over the same thought. That is a rarer virtue than competence, Archie, and it deserved better than what it got. I didn't have an answer for that, so I didn't try to give one, and we drove the rest of the way to Manhattan, mostly in silence, broken only by Diana's occasional sigh from the back seat, and Loyal's steady breathing against my leg, the brass plate on his collar catching the light every time we passed under a gap in the trees. 9118, West 35th Street, home, waiting at the end of the road, with Fritz already planning. Wolfe had telephoned ahead. Naturally, a dinner that would, he'd been assured twice over, involve duck prepared with considerable care and served to absolutely no one, purely on principle. Some traditions, it turns out, are worth keeping faith with too.